Hey guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're gonna make a small comparison between setback on an orchid and winter growth. These are two things that look very similar, but most of us talk about setback because, well, it's the worst of the bunch. So let me remind you really fast, what is a setback? An orchid that undergoes stress such as loss of roots, loss of leaves, or other types of stresses will always grow tinier structures than before. In the case of monopodials, we refer to tinier leaves, but in the case of sympodials, the new structures are the new pseudobulbs. Now this setback can be lighter or more severe. In my case, we have a light setback here, which is absolutely normal. This was not a sick orchid. She still had a few roots. I acquired her last year, so this is the first set of growths. I repotted her, she changed environments, all of the stress-induced growths that are just slightly tinier than the previous ones. But it's not a dramatic change. It's not like we have 1 centimeter growths. This is absolutely normal, and in good conditions with any healthy orchid, new orchid that you acquire, in many cases you will have this type of setback, but it doesn't really mean anything and the new growths can actually still bloom. However, if we're not talking about a new orchid with an excuse to create smaller growths, then there's something in its environment or its care which stresses it. The rule of thumb is the new growth should be as big or even bigger than the previous growths. And in good conditions, this actually happens. Except in winter. Some of the orchids we grow are acquainted with winter, such as the Dendrobium nobilis, and not only. Some orchids really don't grow much in the winter time. They do their main growth in the spring and in the warm months, so the setback is not all that visible. But we also have continuous growers, such as the Cattleyas, which for the main part are worm growers. With orchids such as Cattleyas and other worm-growing orchids which have continuous growth and don't experience winter in their natural habitat, we might experience what we call a winter growth. A winter growth is a tinier growth actually. It looks very much like setback. And in my case, I think you can see the winter growth is this one, which is blooming, but it's really tiny in comparison to the previous growth. In this instance, we are very inclined to believe that we did something, or the roots are not okay, or that the orchid is sick. And sometimes it's none of the above. It's actually the winter. Winter itself is a stress for this orchid since she's not prepared to grow in these conditions. Of course, this will depend on climate and where you actually grow the orchids. So in my example, my orchid room gets kind of chilly in the winter time. The days are shorter, the quantity of light is not the same. Definitely my orchids experience some sort of winter. And this is the result. In other parts of the world, this might not happen. But in my grow room, this is a little bit of a stress for this orchid. Not enough light, not enough warmth to grow normally, not enough hours of light, and so on. And I think this is my most obvious example. This is the BC Saint Andre. I have this orchid for a couple of years already. It bloomed a year before, and last year it bloomed twice on this pseudobulb, and now during winter, because this is an orchid with continuous growth, we produced this tiny pseudobulb. You'd be inclined to believe the orchid is not doing okay, but it has roots. I don't see any damage on it. There's nothing actually wrong with this orchid, and as you can see, it is still receiving light. But the so-called stress is something else. It's the lower temperature, which is not very low to put its life in danger, and also the quantity and the hours of available sunlight, which decreased from summertime, even though, as you can see, we do have enough sun. So the stress here is a very subtle one, and it's not a life-threatening stress for any of my orchids. I do still heat my grow room to acceptable conditions. It just influences growth in some orchids, especially the worm growers, and also flowering. If you can provide corrections, then everything is okay. If you have a heated greenhouse and a light system adequate enough for highlight plants, probably you're not gonna experience setback, although this is not a true setback. In any case, if you experience smaller growth on your orchid, the first thing you need to do is check the root system, check the orchid, make sure everything is okay. But then, if coincidentally it grew during winter time and your conditions are influenced by what's happening outside, that's your answer. Don't freak out. It's normal. It happens to most of us actually. Okay, now that we know a little bit about what both of these types of tinier growths are, let us compare them a little bit. Obviously, stress-induced setback or smaller growth is a lot worse than winter growth. In the case of winter growth, we are talking about some external conditions which are not necessarily up to par. But in the case of setback, severe setback that is, we are talking about loss of roots, loss of leaves, and other things that actually pose a threat to orchids. They put their lives in danger. However, just like I told you in the beginning, a little bit of stress whenever you buy a new orchid and repot it, that's normal and it's absolutely fine. But in the case of severe stress, you can actually see the signs. And what you see in front of you here is an orchid I talked before. This is a Miltonidium that came without roots. It only had one single pseudobulb to survive. Also, it had a spider mite infestation and the leaves just fell off. This is the only remaining leaf which is not functioning properly. It was worst case scenario, and look at the size of the pseudobulbs. Now in the case of winter growth, that's not gonna happen unless you actually maintain your orchid in really deep darkness. With severe stress, this is quite common and quite frustrating. This will also mean that in the future, the orchid will be more finicky, more fragile, so you kind of need to treat it accordingly. It will also mean the orchid will not bloom anytime soon if it looks like this. Stress-induced tinier growth is usually like that. In severe cases, you cannot expect orchids to bloom or to perform normally or to actually be vigorous and easy to manage as a perfectly healthy orchid. While in the case of winter growth, we are definitely not talking about loss of roots or loss of leaves or something that will seriously set back the orchid. In many cases, we actually have quite a mature orchid with numerous previous growths. These growths still store nutrients and hydration, so there is no actual problem with the orchid. If you will, it is actually just an adaptation to external conditions, which just happen to be not as prolific as in summertime. So in this case, the orchid will definitely not be more fragile or more finicky. It will definitely not require you to be more attentive with it. It will definitely not mean it will not bloom. It can very well bloom, and the growths which are tinier than the previous ones will not be extremely tiny. They will just be, in most cases, visibly tiny, but definitely not like the previous case. In the case of a stress-induced setback, a severe one like this, we can experience very slow growth. Even if the new growths are extremely tiny and theoretically they shouldn't take too long to mature, we can actually have months and months in which the new growth just seems to not grow. It actually is, but it does so very slow. Even though the conditions outside might be warm, might be sunny, it doesn't really matter because we're talking about available energy. A setback orchid might need to produce roots and leaves and pseudobulbs all at the same time without much of an energy resource. So everything should be done very slowly because the orchid itself is hydrating, feeding, and photosynthesizing very slowly. In the case of the winter growth, this doesn't happen. A new growth will not necessarily mature in the same amount of time as in the summertime simply due to the slowed down metabolism in wintertime. But definitely it's not going to be excruciatingly slow. It will be similar to how a normal growth would develop. And this is because this orchid already has older growth that stores nutrients and energy. It already has roots. It doesn't need to create a whole lot of structures at the same time with limited resources. This orchid feeds correctly, hydrates correctly. It just grows a little slower, mostly due to the temperature. It doesn't photosynthesize as much, yes, because we don't have long days, so the quantity of actual food produced is a little lower, but it's not impaired in any way. Now, monopodial orchids such as Phalaenopsis, Vandas, and whatever other orchids don't have fans or pseudobulbs, they can show signs of stress or setback as well. But in their case, we are referring to tinier leaves. So in the case of root loss or leaf loss or anything that puts the life of an orchid in danger, you will first have very tiny leaves, and then as new leaves are produced, they will be bigger and bigger. However, here is a very interesting case, and this happens with the Phalaenopsis orchid. Even though this orchid does have continuous growth, it doesn't necessarily have leaf continuous growth. Despite some articles or videos, these orchids never take a break actually. They don't require winter rests, they don't require dormancies or anything of the sorts. They don't require you to lower the light quantity. not even to actually stop fertilizing. If they don't grow leaves, they will grow something else, like roots or flower spikes. In the winter time, usually flower spikes are growing. Now this orchid does something quite interesting. It pauses leaf growth. It does not pause root growth, but leaf growth, yes. And you can end up with an orchid which has a tiny leaf at the top which just doesn't do anything during winter time, and when the flower spike is done, it bloomed and it fell, then the leaf will start growing, and many of the times it will grow to the size of the previous leaf. This is a specific behavior to the Phalaenopsis orchid. It doesn't mean it's a winter setback or a winter growth. It doesn't mean the orchid is sick or stressed in any way. It is a type of stress maybe, but the orchid is actually programmed to handle it. She's creating a flower spike. And the main focus of this orchid in this season is the creation of the flower spike. So it will put all of its energy into the flower spike. You might ask, well, okay, why does it only pause the leaves and not the roots? Well, let's think about priorities here. What does this orchid need? Water and nutrients. And also something to photosynthesize. Well, we already have a lot of leaves, don't we? These leaves are perfectly capable to photosynthesize and maintain the flower spike. But if we did not have enough roots to maintain all of these leaves and the brand new flower spike which is still developing, then we wouldn't have what to photosynthesize, right? So the priority during the season for this orchid is the creation of the flower spike and also maintaining and improving constantly the root system, which brings water and nutrients to the leaves. Due to the number of the leaves already present, we don't necessarily need new leaves, another new leaf. Therefore, the energy spent on growing leaves can be redirected into the spike, and the orchid will continue to work normally. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? But in this case, we cannot talk about setback because it's not. This leaf will continue to grow, but after the flower spike is done. Bottom line, winter growth, which is a little smaller than the previous growth, is nothing to worry about, and it is quite normal, especially if we don't have an automated greenhouse or grow room. We usually grow our orchids in the home or in a separate room. That's okay, it's bound to happen. If you don't have the effects of winter so strong, you might not experience any of this, and that's okay. And even if you do experience it, you will not experience it with all orchids, and that's okay as well. But in the case of severe setback, the tinier growth is indeed something we need to expect, we need to embrace, and all in all, we just need patience. So alrighty guys, thank you so much for watching this video, hope you found it interesting, and you know the drill. If you did like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!